"This is a working kennel, sir, not a petting zoo. I need you to step back from the fence." Lieutenant Kendra Ravenwood did not raise her voice. She did not have to. 19 days of failure had worn her tone down to something flat and final, and she said the line the way a person shuts a drawer that keeps sticking. "What is wrapped in the handkerchief in the old man's shirt pocket, and why does he touch it every time the kennel gate opens?" Nobody watching that Tuesday morning at the Millhaven Joint Working Dog Transition Center had any reason to ask. They only saw a stooped farmer in a rust-colored coat standing at a chain-link fence he had no business standing at, and a lieutenant with a tablet in one hand and a federal contract in the other, walking toward him like she meant to close a gate that had never really opened. Behind her, in the last run on the East Row, a Belgian Malinois named Copper was working himself into the corner of the concrete pad, head low, hackles raised in patches, a low sound coming out of him that was not quite a growl and not quite anything else anyone had a name for. 6 years old. 2 combat deployments behind him and a service record thick with commendations, and for 19 days he had not eaten, had not taken a leash, had not let a single handler closer than the width of the run without going to the wire like something with a fuse lit. Thursday, the Federal Review Board would sit down at 0900 and decide whether the whole transition program kept its funding, and Copper's file was the one Ravenwood could not make balance. 79 years old, the man at the fence. 19 days, the dog behind her. 3 days, until the number that mattered got read into a record in Washington. Nobody in that yard yet knew what those 3 figures had to do with one another, or that they would, before Thursday came, turn out to be the same story wearing 3 different clothes. The kennel staff had gathered the way staff gather at any workplace where something is about to become a story, not quite watching, angled just enough to watch. A tech near the wash station stopped scrubbing a stainless bowl. 2 kennel assistants by the feed room paused mid-sentence. Somewhere behind them all, a young man named Corey Mosier, 24 years old and 3 weeks into the job, went very still in a way that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition he could not yet explain to himself. Everett Satterfield did not step back from the fence right away. He looked at Ravenwood the way a man looks at weather he has already decided he is going to stand in. His right hand, resting on the top rail, trembled faintly, the kind of tremor that lives in a body long enough that the body stops apologizing for it. In his shirt pocket, beneath a barn coat gone the color of an old fence post, something small shifted against his chest when he breathed, wrapped in cloth, carried the way other men carry a wallet or a rosary. "I heard you," he said. 2 words, not defiant, not pleading, just spoken, the way a man states the time of day. Then he stepped back exactly 1 pace, no more, no less, and stood with his cap in his hands, watching the dog in the corner of that run like he already knew something none of the diagnostics in Ravenwood's tablet had found in 19 days of trying. If you've ever been written off by someone who never bothered to ask your name, type steady in the comments. Because in 3 days, this kennel and everyone in it would learn exactly whose name they had been standing in front of the whole time, and exactly what price gets paid, decades late, when a man's history gets folded down into a number nobody thinks to read. He had been parking in the gravel turnout across from the Millhaven gate for 4 years before anyone thought to ask him in. Always on visiting days, always the same maroon pickup with the tailgate rust-freckled at the corners, always arriving at 8:45 and leaving by 11 whether or not the gate had ever opened for him. He never brought a lawn chair. He never brought binoculars, the way some old veterans did who liked to watch the young dogs work the agility course from a respectful distance and call it Sunday entertainment. He came, he sat with both hands on the wheel, and he watched the kennel building the way another man might watch a house he used to live in. Not with longing exactly, something quieter and harder to name than that, something closer to accounting. His coat had been rust-colored once on purpose. Now it was rust-colored by 40 years of weather, doing what it does to a barn coat left on a hook by the door. The flannel shirt under it had gone soft at the elbows, the particular way flannel goes soft when it has been washed by the same woman, and then by no one, for longer than most of the young people at that kennel had been alive. His cap, a seed corn cap that had once announced a feed company nobody local still remembered, had bleached down to a color that was less a color than an absence of one. The bill curled from being pulled low against 40 autumns of wind. His hands told the rest of it. The left one lay easy at his side, spotted ordinary, an old man's hand. The right one carried a fine tremor at rest, a small, persistent shiver that ran from the wrist into the fingers whenever the hand had nothing in particular to hold. It was the kind of tremor a doctor might have a name for and a chart to track, except that Everett Satterfield had never gone to a doctor about it, because he already knew what it meant and did not need a diagnosis to tell him. 56 years of asking that hand to be steady in places where steadiness was the only thing standing between a man and the ground blowing up under him had used something up in it that never grew back. What the hand had left, it saved. It saved it without being told to for exactly one purpose. The moment his fingers closed around anything resembling a leash clasp, the tremor stopped as though a switch had been thrown, and the hand became, for as long as it needed to be, the same hand it had been in 1966. In his shirt pocket over his heart, he carried a handkerchief folded into a small stiff square, and inside the handkerchief, a brass leash clasp, hand-filed smooth along one edge where a thumb had worried at it for longer than most marriages last. He touched it without appearing to touch it, a press of 2 fingers flat against his chest, quick, almost involuntary, the way another man might touch a coat button to be sure it was still fastened. It was Corey Mosier who noticed him first. 3 weeks into a job Corey had taken because he liked dogs more than he liked people, and had not expected to find out this early that the two were not always separable. Corey was supposed to log visitor traffic at the gate, check names against an approved list, keep the public well back from a facility that housed dogs decompressing from things the public did not need explained to them. He was supposed to do a great many things according to a laminated sheet taped inside the guard shack, and on his 4th Wednesday, he did none of them. He walked out to the gravel turnout, knocked once on the truck's rolled-down window frame, and said, "You always sit here on visiting days." Not a question. Everett looked over, unhurried, and said, "I do." "You want to come to the fence? Not the runs, just the fence." Corey said it fast, like a boy passing a note in class, aware he had no authority to make the offer and making it anyway. Everett studied him, not long, but with the specific attention of a man deciding whether a stranger's kindness was going to cost the stranger something. Then he nodded once and got out of the truck slower than his age alone would explain, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other pressed flat for half a second against his shirt pocket before it fell away. That had become the pattern. Corey never told anyone above him. Everett never asked for more than the fence line offered. He would stand with his forearms on the top rail for the length of a visiting hour, saying almost nothing, watching whichever dogs were run through the yard that day with an attention that had no wasted motion in it at all. And when 11 o'clock came, he would touch 2 fingers to his cap in Corey's direction, get back in the truck, and drive the 11 miles home to a farmhouse kitchen where a percolator waited on a stove that had heated water for 2 people, and then, for 6 years now, for 1. He kept the radio off on those drives. He did not need it. Some low hum would rise up out of him unbidden around the 2nd-mile marker, wordless at first and then finding its shape. 4 notes repeating, worn into a familiar shallow groove, the same 4 notes Ida Satterfield used to hum over a stove, crowded with mason jars every September of their married life, canning tomatoes and green beans with a hymn running under her breath like a current under still water. He did not remember deciding to keep humming it after she was gone. It had simply kept coming, the way water keeps finding the same low ground in a field no matter how many years pass, and he had let it, because it seemed to him a poor kind of love that needed reminding to continue. He never explained the humming to Corey Mosier, and Corey never asked, sensing correctly that some doors a young man ought to wait to be invited through rather than knock on. What Corey did instead, without being told to and without knowing why it mattered yet, was start keeping half an eye on which dog occupied that last run on the East Row, and start noticing that Everett Satterfield's gaze, on visiting days, went there first and stayed there longest. 4 years running, long before anyone at Millhaven had ever heard the name Copper. Lieutenant Kendra Ravenwood was, whatever else the next 3 days would prove about her, genuinely good at her work, and the kennel staff gathered at the training yard that Tuesday afternoon watched her prove it within minutes. The dog was a young Dutch shepherd named Bracken, 18 months into transition and prone to bolting at sudden engine noise, a leftover reflex from a deployment nobody in that yard needed spelled out further than that. Ravenwood knelt at a clean 45-degree angle to him, tablet propped against her knee, and ran a sequence that had clearly been drilled 100 times before it ever reached a real dog. A graduated tone through a speaker no bigger than a matchbox, starting below the threshold of Bracken's flinch and climbing by increments so small the dog's ears barely twitched at each new step. She narrated as she worked, the habit of a woman used to being recorded and evaluated by people who were not in the room. Per the protocol, we're at 14 decibels above baseline with zero avoidance response, she said, mostly to the tablet, partly to the small audience of techs behind her. Behavioral thresholds climbing on schedule. That's real progress. That's 14 years of published research doing exactly what it's built to do. Bracken's tail gave one loose, unhurried wag, and 2 kennel assistants actually applauded, and it was, by any fair measure, a small and genuine piece of mastery. A woman who had earned her rank and her tablet both, doing careful work with a frightened animal and getting it right. Which was precisely why what she did next, 40 feet away at the east row, landed with the weight it did. Everett Satterfield was standing where Corey had left him the week before, forearms on the rail outside Copper's Run, saying nothing, when Ravenwood came around the corner of the kennel building with a laminated badge check clipped to her belt and stopped like she had walked into a low branch. "Sir." The word came out with none of the softness the word usually carries. "This area is restricted past the visitor line. I need to see identification." Everett produced a driver's license from a cracked leather wallet without hurrying, the way a man hands over papers he has handed over 1,000 times before to people with less patience than this one. Ravenwood turned it over once, checked the photograph against his face with a flick of her eyes, and said, "Satterfield, you're not on today's cleared list." "Wasn't aware there was one to be on," Everett said. "There's always one." She said it flatly, and then, louder, pitched for the small gathering that had begun to form the way gatherings do at any hint of friction, a wash tech, 2 kennel assistants, Corey Mosier hanging back near the feed room pretending to check a clipboard he was not reading. "Folks, this is a federally funded transition program housing decorated working dogs with documented behavioral trauma. We don't get to have members of the public wandering the runs because they like animals. I don't care how long you've been parking across the street, that's not a credential." A ripple of laughter went through 2 of the younger techs, quick and reflexive, the kind that comes from relief rather than cruelty. Glad to have someone else be the one standing at the center of the lieutenant's attention. Everett let it pass over him the way a fence post lets weather pass over it. He did not raise his voice, did not straighten up in offense, did not do any of the things a man does when he is trying to be believed. "He knows something's near him he can't place yet," Everett said instead, nodding once toward Copper's Run, where the dog had gone rigid against the back wall, ears flat, eyes fixed not on Ravenwood or the crowd, but on some middle distance none of them could see. "That's not aggression you're logging. That's a dog waiting on a signal that isn't coming." Ravenwood's jaw tightened, the reaction of someone whose read on a room had just been contradicted by someone with no business contradicting it. "With respect, sir, I've got 4 years of specialized handler training and a behavioral model built on 1,100 documented cases. I think I can read one dog." She said it evenly, but there was an edge under the evenness now, the edge of a woman with a report due Wednesday and a board sitting Thursday, and no patience left over for an old man in a bleached-out cap telling her what her own instruments were failing to say. "I'm going to need you to head back to the visitor lot, sir." The word landed the second time exactly the way it had the first, correct, procedural, and carrying no respect in it at all. Everett touched 2 fingers to his cap, the same small gesture he gave Corey Mosier at the end of every visiting hour, and turned to go. And if anyone in that yard had been watching his other hand instead of his face, they would have seen it press flat for half a second against this shirt pocket, over the handkerchief, over the clasp, before falling still at his side. It was Corey Mosier who found him in the lot 20 minutes later and said, low enough that it wouldn't carry, "She's not wrong about the model. She's just never seen it fail before." Everett looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at somebody who has just, without knowing it, said something true. "Most models don't fail," Everett said. "They just run out of what they can measure." He did not leave that day. Colonel Braden Hackney was 3 days from being summoned, the though nobody in that yard knew his name yet, and the file with Everett's history in it was still sitting, unopened, in a records room nobody had thought to search. But Corey Mosier walked back to the fence with him anyway, quietly, past the visitor line, and said nothing at all when Ravenwood, 20 feet away and furious with a report she couldn't make balance, chose for once not to notice. They let him stand outside the run itself the next morning, not because anyone changed their mind about him, but because Corey told his shift supervisor the old man was quiet and harmless, and Ravenwood, buried in spreadsheets for the Wednesday draft, did not have the hours to spare on arguing about a fence line twice in 1 week. Everett stood at the wire for 1 hour and 40 minutes without speaking a single word. He did not fidget. He did not shift his weight from foot to foot the way a man does when standing is starting to cost him something, though at 79 it surely was. He watched copper the way another man might watch weather building over a distant ridge, reading, not staring, the difference being that a man who stares is waiting to be entertained, and a man who reads is gathering something he intends to use. Copper worked a tight, worn path along the back wall of the run, 11 steps one direction, a half turn, 11 steps back, the concrete there scuffed pale from 19 days of the same track laid down over and over. Twice, a kennel assistant walked a food bowl to the gate slot, and the dog did not so much refuse it as failed to acknowledge that it existed at all, the way a grieving man fails to hear his own name called across a room. Everett noted, without moving his head, that the dog's ears tracked sound before his eyes ever did. Every clang of a gate 3 runs down, every rattle of the feed cart drew the ears first, swiveling like small dishes, while the eyes stayed fixed on that same unfixed middle distance. He noted that Copper never once lay down fully, not even in the false rest of exhaustion. He folded part way, haunches low, forelegs braced, in the posture of an animal that has decided lying down is no longer safe to do. He noted the specific angle of the head drop, chin nearly to the chest, that came each time a handler's voice pitched up half a register in the frustrated, coaxing way voices do when they are trying too hard to sound like they aren't trying. Ravenwood came out at the 90-minute mark with her tablet under her arm, saw him still standing there, and did not order him off this time, only stood a few feet away herself, arms crossed, watching the dog watch nothing, waiting to see whether the old man was going to do anything at all besides waste an hour of daylight. "He's been logged at 11 distinct approach failures," she said, not quite to Everett, not quite to herself. "Every handler, every protocol variant we've got. He won't take a leash, won't take a hand, won't take food from anyone standing." She said it the way a person recites a losing hand of cards, half hoping saying it aloud might change what was in it. Everett let a long moment pass before he answered, long enough that Ravenwood had already half turned away, assuming there would be no answer at all. "You've been testing whether he'll come to you," he said. "Might try testing whether he'll let you not need him to." Ravenwood turned back. "That's not a protocol." "No," Everett agreed. "It's a dog." She opened her mouth to say something sharp, the kind of correction that comes easily to a person exhausted past the point of patience, and then stopped, because something in the plainness of what he'd said had gotten past the place where her arguments usually caught fire. She looked back at Copper, still working his 11 steps, still folding rather than lying, still listening to everything and looking at nothing. And for the first time in 19 days, she found herself wondering whether her instruments had been measuring the wrong half of the problem the entire time. Not what the dog refused, but what the dog was still, despite everything, waiting for. "He hasn't attacked you," she said slowly, working it out loud the way a careful thinker does. "He's attacked every leash we've offered, every hand, but he hasn't gone at the fence once since you've been standing there." "No," Everett said, "he hasn't." "Why not?" Everett didn't answer that one directly. He reached up instead and pressed 2 fingers flat against his shirt pocket, the gesture Corey Mosier had clocked a dozen times without understanding it, and said only, "Dog like that isn't dangerous. He's not broken either, whatever your reports say. He's waiting on something he already knows the shape of, and nobody in this yard has offered him the shape yet." He looked at her, not unkindly. "Your equipment's been testing what's in front of it. It can't test for what isn't there anymore." Ravenwood didn't answer that. She stood with her arms crossed for a while longer, watching the dog, watching the old man watching the dog, and something in her face had gone quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet all week. Not agreement, not yet, but the particular stillness of a person whose certainty has just taken on a very small, very persistent leak. She did not order him off the fence line again. When her shift ended, she left him standing there and drove home, turning over 11 distinct approach failures and one dog who would not go at a fence he had gone at for everyone else and could not, for the life of her, make the arithmetic of it come out clean. Wednesday morning, with the funding report due by end of day and no better idea left to try, Ravenwood did something she would later describe to Colonel Hackney as the least scientific decision of her career. She opened the gate to Copper's Run and told Everett Satterfield he had 10 minutes, and God help them both if it went wrong. He did not go in fast. He did not go in slow either, in the exaggerated, careful way people move around dogs they are afraid of. He went in at the same unhurried pace he crossed any threshold, a man entering a room he had every right to be in. Copper's head came up off his chest, ears forward, the whole compact weight of him gathering onto his forelegs the way a dog gathers before a lunge. Everett stopped 6 feet short and lowered himself to one knee. It cost him something. Corey, watching from the gate, saw the old man's free hand brace hard against his thigh to manage the drop, saw the flare of effort cross his face and pass, but he made the knee, and once down, he was still in a way that had nothing performed in it at all. He reached into his shirt pocket. The tremor was there in his hand as it rose, visible, ordinary, an old man's hand doing an old man's small shake, and then his fingers closed around the folded handkerchief, and the shake simply stopped, the way a motor cuts out mid-turn. He unfolded the cloth with his other hand, slow, one corner at a time, until the brass clasp lay bare in his palm, worn dull gold, filed smooth along one edge by a thumb that had worried at it for 56 years. He did not hold it out. He simply opened his hand, flat, palm up, the clasp resting in the center of it, and lifted 2 fingers of his other hand in a small, exact motion. Not a command any protocol in that building had on file, not a gesture any tablet had ever logged, a slow closing and opening of 2 fingers against the thumb, once, and then stillness. Copper's ears dropped, not flat in fear, down and back, the soft fold of an animal listening to something with its whole body. The low sound he'd carried in his chest for 19 days cut off mid-breath. Ravenwood, mid-sentence at the gate. "Sir, if he goes for your hand, I need you to—" Stop talking entirely, the sentence just hanging there unfinished in the cold morning air, because Copper had already crossed the 6 feet of concrete between them in 4 unhurried steps and pressed the crown of his skull directly into the center of Everett's open palm, brass clasp and all, and gone still, not tense, still, not braced, not still the way water goes still. Nobody in that yard made a sound for a long 5 seconds. Then Corey Mosier, without meaning to say it out loud, whispered, "He's never done that, not once, not for anybody." And Ravenwood stood frozen at the gate with her tablet hanging forgotten at her side, staring at an 80-pound Belgian Malinois leaning his entire weight into the palm of a man she had twice ordered off her property, and finding, for the first time in 19 exhausting days, that she had absolutely nothing in her protocol that told her what to write down. Colonel Braden Hackney arrived at Millhaven that same afternoon in a government sedan with government plates, 61 years old, and carrying the particular unhurried authority of a man who had spent 4 decades being the calmest person in whatever room he entered. Ravenwood had called him herself, voice tighter than she wanted it to be, describing a dog that had gone still under a stranger's hand after 19 days of refusing every trained handler in the building, and asking, in words she chose carefully, whether the program had a policy for a civilian who might need to be either arrested or thanked. Hackney walked the kennel row first, said very little, and watched Copper through the wire, the dog lying fully flat now for the first time since intake, chin on his paws, eyes half closed, the posture of an animal that has finally decided the ground beneath him will hold. Then he asked to see the man. Everett was still at the fence when Hackney found him, cap in hand, the brass clasp back in its handkerchief, and the handkerchief back in his shirt pocket. Hackney studied him for a long moment, the coat, the trembling hand gone still, now that it had nothing to hold, the economy of a man who did not waste a single motion standing there. "Colonel Braden Hackney," he said, offering a hand. "I run this program's oversight. Lieutenant Ravenwood tells me you did something in 10 minutes 19 days of specialists couldn't manage. Everett Satterfield, Everett said, and shook the offered hand once, firm, brief. Service history? Marine Corps, 63 to 68. Something crossed Hackney's face at that, quick and involuntary, gone before it could be named. Handler. Scout and mine dogs, Da Nang and around it mostly. Hackney nodded slowly, the nod of a man doing arithmetic he did not expect to be doing on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd like to verify that if you don't mind. Not because I doubt you, he added, and something in the way he said it suggested he half meant it, and half didn't yet know how much he meant it. Because if you did what I think you did in that run, this program is going to need your name in a file somewhere before Thursday, or nobody on that funding board is going to believe a word of what I write down. Thursday, 0900. The Federal Review Board, the contract renewal, Copper's transfer recommendation sitting half-drafted on Ravenwood's desk, all of it converged now on a deadline that had, until this moment, belonged only to the institution, and now, plainly, belonged to Everett Satterfield too. The file came up on a records terminal in a back office 20 minutes later, pulled by a clerk who had clearly pulled 1,000 files before and expected this one to look like all the others. It did not. Where a handler's file should have carried a name, a unit, a chain of dogs trained and certified across a career, this one carried a single line. Consolidated Service Citation, Batch 40C, Marine Corps K-9 Program, Records Adjustment, no name, no dog, no date past 1966. Hackney read it twice, his face very still. This isn't your file, he said. It's the only one there is, Everett said, and there was no anger in it, only the flat weariness of a man stating something he had apparently known or suspected for a very long time and never had cause to say aloud. Wasn't the first time I went looking. Won't surprise you to hear it wasn't the last either. Hackney looked at the screen, then at the old man in the faded coat, then back at the screen, and for the first time since he'd walked through the gate that afternoon, Colonel Braden Hackney looked like a man who was no longer sure which direction the dead in this room was owed. Corey Mosier volunteered to dig further before anyone asked him to, which was, by then, exactly the kind of thing Corey Mosier had become known for doing. He found the batch number by 9 that evening, 3 hours after everyone else had gone home, in a records room that smelled of dust and cold coffee, working through microfiche nobody had touched in years because nobody had needed to. Batch 40C. 40 individual handler and K-9 service files, each one carrying its own name, its own dog, its own citations, consolidated 14 years ago into a single generic line under the signature of a program administrator named only in the surviving paperwork as Director Aldridge. The reasoning, when Corey finally traced it through a budget memo attached 3 pages later, was almost banal in its smallness. The insurance and records management contractor serving the program had changed that year, and the new contract charged by the individual file. 40 files consolidated into one meant 39 fewer line items on an invoice. It had cost 39 men and every dog they had ever trained, their names, not through malice, not through any decision made about them personally, but through a spreadsheet balancing itself 14 years after the fact on the backs of people who would never know it had happened. Corey sat with that for a long moment before he did the second piece of digging, the one that turned his stomach. Ravenwood's draft funding report, open on a shared terminal, already recommended Copper's transfer, not back to a handler's home, but to a private contractor kennel under a standing consolidation services agreement, the same company, Corey found with a cold, sinking certainty whose original contract with the program dated to the same year as Batch 40C. The system, still 14 years later, was quietly moving in the same direction it always had. A washout dog, a saved line item, a contractor who profited either way. Nobody currently drawing a paycheck at Millhaven had built that current. They were only standing in it, the way water finds the same low ground in a field no matter who is watching. Corey printed both documents and walked them to Ravenwood's office before he let himself think better of it. She was still there, past 10, staring at the same draft report she'd been unable to finish since Copper's file first crossed her desk. "You need to see this before you sign anything," Corey said, and set both pages on the desk in front of her. She read the budget memo first, then the contractor agreement, then read them both again, more slowly. And when she looked up, her face had lost the flat certainty it had carried all week. I recommended sending him to the exact company that benefited from erasing 39 men's names, she said, very quietly, mostly to herself. My data was right about every measurable thing in that dog. I never once thought to ask what my data couldn't measure. She looked at the report on her screen, at the recommendation she had drafted in good faith and near exhaustion, and did not touch the keyboard again that night. Colonel Hackney was still at Millhaven past 9 that night, standing in the records room with the 1966 field logbook Corey Mosier had pulled from a fireproof cabinet nobody had opened in a decade, when the arithmetic Everett Satterfield's name had started that afternoon finished itself in front of him. The logbook was handwritten, the ink gone brown, the pages soft at the corners from handling that had stopped abruptly and then never resumed. Hackney turned through it slowly, reading unit numbers, dog names, brief clipped notations in a handwriting he did not recognize, but that Everett, standing quietly at his shoulder, clearly did. "There," Everett said, and put one finger, steady now, on a line halfway down a page dated deep in 1966. Squad north of a river crossing, 14 men. Dog cleared 11 devices ahead of them over 2 days before the line moved. Hackney read the entry once and then read the unit designation a second time, and the color went out of his face the way color goes out of a man's face when a fact he has carried his whole life, without examining, suddenly rearranges itself into something entirely different. "My father," he said, "was in that unit." His voice, which had been level and procedural all afternoon, caught hard on the word father, splitting it almost in half. "He came home. He always said a dog walked that river crossing before any of them did. He never had the handler's name. Said the paperwork never carried it." He looked up from the logbook at Everett Satterfield's weathered face, as though seeing an entirely different man than the one who had stood at the fence 3 days earlier. "That was your dog." "Anvil," Everett said. Just the name, offered plainly, the way a man says a word he has said to himself 10,000 times, and only rarely allowed to anyone else. Hackney did not say anything for a long moment. Then he came to attention in that dusty records room, in street clothes, at 9 o'clock at night, the way men come to attention when no one has ordered it, and everyone in the room understands exactly why. "Sir," he said, and the word cracked clean down the middle. "It's an honor." It should have been the end of it. It was not. Because the second reversal, when it came not from the past, but from the run at the east end of the kennel row, where Ravenwood had spent the better part of that same evening reviewing 19 days of behavioral logs against the one variable she had never thought to chart. Not what Copper had refused, but what and who his last handler had been trained by. She found it near midnight, cross-referencing training lineages the way Corey had cross-referenced budget lines, a chain of instructors, program to program, decade to decade, each one teaching the next a specific closed-hand stillness signal nobody had bothered to document because it had never been official, only passed handler to handler. The way a family recipe passes mother to daughter, its origin forgotten well before its 3rd or 4th generation. Of use. Copper's last handler had learned it from an instructor in a program 2 commands removed from Millhaven. That instructor had learned it from another. And at the root of the chain, 4 links back, unlisted, uncredited, unrecorded in any protocol manual currently in service, was a name the lineage itself had long since stopped remembering. Satterfield. Ravenwood sat with that for a long time before she went and found Hackney and Everett still in the records room. "My data wasn't wrong," she said when she could say it steadily. "Every measurement I took was accurate. Copper wasn't broken and he wasn't badly trained. He was missing one specific signal his own handler used with him every day of his life, a signal his handler didn't even know he'd inherited from somewhere 4 teachers back." She looked at Everett, and something in her face had gone entirely unguarded. It was never a flaw in the model. It was a thing the model was never built to see in the first place. They gathered in the small conference room off the kennel office the next morning. Hackney, Ravenwood, Corey Mosier hovering near the door, a handful of staff who had been there the day Everett was turned away from the fence, because Hackney had asked plainly whether Everett would tell them what he knew, and Everett had said he would, though not at any length. Anvil worked beside me 2 tours, he said, both hands resting on the table, the right one perfectly steady, now that it had something solid under it. Cleared more ground than I ever got proper credit for, which never mattered to him and shouldn't matter much to anybody now. He came home with me. Lived 11 years on the farm after. Died old in his sleep under the oak by the equipment shed. And I buried him myself. And never once needed a piece of paper to tell me what he was worth. He paused, the room entirely silent around him. My wife, Ida, kept barn cats the whole time we were married. Skittish things, half wild, wouldn't come near a hand that reached for them. She had a way of closing 2 fingers slow against her thumb, just so, and going still, and waiting. Took her years to teach me it wasn't the hand that mattered. It was the waiting. He lifted 2 fingers now, the same small motion he'd given Copper in the run, and let them fall still again. I taught Anvil that same signal because it worked on a scared animal same as it worked on a barn cat. Man, I trained under me, learned it watching me use it, never wrote it down. Neither did the next one, nor the one after that. Didn't know I was giving anybody a legacy. I was just trying to calm a dog the only way my wife ever taught me how. He looked at Ravenwood directly for the first time since the fence. I didn't come back for the dog to remember me, he said. I came so somebody would remember him. The silence that followed had weight in it. Ravenwood broke it first, her voice smaller than anyone in that room had heard it all week. Will you teach me the signal properly? Not to log it, just teach it to me the way it was taught to you. Everett studied her a moment, the way he'd studied Corey at the fence 3 weeks before, and nodded once. There's one thing I'd ask instead of thanks, he said to Hackney now. Batch 40C, 40 names, including a dog's. I'd like them back in the record before Thursday. Mine and Anvil's can sit wherever they sit. The other 38 deserve it same as we do. Thursday morning, 0900, the Federal Review Board convened at Millhaven with Colonel Hackney standing to open the session himself, a folder in his hand, thicker than the one that had been prepared the week before. He read the corrected record aloud. 40 names restored, 40 dogs credited. The consolidation order that had erased them traced plainly to a decision made 14 years earlier for the price of an invoice. And by the time he reached the 40th name, the room had gone as still as a kennel run at dawn. The board renewed the program's funding unanimously and wrote into the minutes, at Hackney's insistence, a formal review of the contractor relationship Corey Mosier had traced back to that same old decision. Copper's file closed the same afternoon, not with a transfer order to any contractor kennel, but with a release form bearing Everett Satterfield's name and signature, granting one retired Marine Corps dog handler, 79 years old, custody of one working dog no longer required to prove to anyone that he was already healed. Weeks later, on an ordinary morning with the light still gray at the window, Everett Satterfield sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, the brass clasp resting on the table beside it, unwrapped now, no longer needing the handkerchief to keep it safe from anything. Near the door, on the same nail where Anvil's leash had hung for 11 years after the war, hung a new leash, Copper's. The dog himself, asleep across the threshold of the kitchen in a patch of early sun, breathing slow and even. Everett hummed 4 notes into his coffee, low, the same 4 notes he had hummed alone in a truck cab for 6 years running. And for the first time since Ida passed, the kitchen did not feel entirely like a room built for one man and a memory. Some debts take 50 years to come due, and they still come due in full, not with parades, not with headlines, but with a name read aloud in a quiet room and a dog finally willing to lie down.